Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here, and I'm really glad you've joined me today in our Bible reading plan. We are in Psalm 137, and I have to admit, when I read this psalm, it almost felt out of place because it's preceded by a collection of psalms that are referred to as the Psalms or Songs of Ascent. We've talked about that previously, that these were psalms that the people would chant, they would sing as worship on their way to the temple, up to Jerusalem to worship. And then following this psalm is a collection of psalms written by King David that focus on praising God and giving thanks, on asking God for guidance and protection. But then in between those two collections of psalms is this one, and it is dramatically different. It's written in Babylon by an unknown author shortly after the Jewish people were exiled as slaves to Babylon when Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. Look at the first three verses. He said, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept." We just sat down and cried. Ancient Babylon was known for not only having the Euphrates River, but a very vast canal system. And the Jewish exiles settled in certain areas, certain villages, certain places along those canals. And so that's what he's referring to by the river here. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion, the name for Jerusalem and the temple and their home. Upon the willows in the midst of it, the willow trees by the riverbanks or the canal banks, we hung our harps, for there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." So get the picture. In 587, 86 BC, the third and final attack on Jerusalem by the Babylonians occurred. It was about a 2-year siege, and before the walls collapsed and the Babylonians destroyed the city, they'd already destroyed the outlying countryside. They basically captured the nation, and only the capital remained. And during that 2 years of siege, it was so severe that people were dying from starvation. There was famine. It got so bad that they cannibalized the bodies of the deceased, including their own children. It was horrible. And then Babylon breached the walls, knocked down the walls of the city, burned the temple, killed thousands of people, men, women, children, carried people, thousands more away as slaves to Babylon. So it was just a horrible thing. So here are these exiles who had experienced all of that tragedy. They're in Babylon. They're at this new place they're going to have to live and die, sitting by the banks of one of those canals in sorrow. And their Babylonian captors mock them by saying, "Hey, why don't you sing us some of those great songs of praise and faith in your God? Why don't you sing to us the songs you used to sing when you celebrated your God back in Zion in the temple?" They were mocking them. Can you imagine how hard this was? And so in verse 4, he says, "How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land?" Emotionally, it was hard on them, but their faith would not allow them to forget God or their homeland. Verse 5, he says, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget her ability to play an instrument. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy." If I don't keep celebrating God and Jerusalem, the temple, and my home, and us being God's people, may my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. May I lose the ability to even speak. So their faith would not allow them to give up. And then the author turns and asks God to punish those who had punished them. Ask God to take vengeance on those who had devastated their nation and their people. Verse 7, He says, remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom. That's the descendants of Esau. The day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundation. In other words, the Edomites, the descendants of Esau, were cheering on the Babylonians when they were destroying Jerusalem. And then we also know from the Old Testament and other sources that following the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians, the Edomites went into the city and plundered it. They went in and whatever scraps they found that they wanted, they took for themselves. And he's saying, God, would you remember what they did? And then he talks about Babylon in verses 8 and 9. O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, how blessed will be the one who repays you with the recompense with which you have repaid us. Babylon, listen, how blessed. The Hebrew word means a state of happiness. How happy will be the people who do to you what you did to us. Verse 9, how blessed, how much in a state of happiness will be the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Now that verse troubles a lot of people, and I understand that. But need to remember that Isaiah the prophet, more than a century before the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylons, prophesied the collapse of Babylon. It's in Isaiah chapter 13. Don't have time to read all of it, but one verse, verse 16 in Isaiah 13 says, their little ones also will be dashed to pieces before their eyes. Their houses will be plundered and their wives ravished. Isaiah was prophesying that a day would come when a pagan nation would destroy Babylon, and it would be done in a cruel manner. Psalm 137 verse 9 is picking up on that prophecy and asking God to let that prophecy come true. He's asking God to fulfill it. And what Isaiah said and what Psalm 137 verse 9 picks up on is that just as the Babylonians rejoiced when they destroyed Jerusalem and now they were mocking them, sing your songs of praise now, the nation, the army, the soldiers that destroy Babylon, they will be just as happy as the Babylonians are right now. That's what he's saying. War in ancient times was often very, very cruel. And it was waged without regard to men, women, or children. We think of war as two armies fighting on a field somewhere among themselves, and that sometimes happened. But war also involved armies attacking cities. I mean, what do you think happened when the Babylonian army attacked the city of Jerusalem? Do you think only soldiers died? No. Thousands and thousands and thousands of civilians died. That's the way war was fought. Because armies and everybody would retreat to a city, and you didn't win the war unless you took the city, and you couldn't take the city without some innocents, as we would call them today, dying. The same thing was going to be true when Babylon failed. That's all this is saying. The Bible teaches, here's my devotional thought. You know, the scripture teaches, Jesus teaches that we as his followers, as his disciples, we do not take vengeance. Vengeance belongs to the Lord. But when it comes to nations, the Bible teaches that God has set up nations, ordained government to carry out the sword of justice and punishment. And that's more than just the criminal system. Sometimes it unfortunately involves war. Because without an army and without war in this evil fallen world, evil nations take over. And sometimes even today, to stop evil, civilians, including children, pay the price. Think about the end of World War II. When America dropped those 2 atomic bombs on Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And civilians and large numbers died. But if those bombs had not been dropped, estimates are 500,000 to 750,000 of American soldiers would have died invading Japan to end it. Plus, they had armed Japanese citizens to fight to the death. The truth is, if the bombs had not been dropped, more than 1 million people, American and Japanese, would have died. So which is worse? What could have been or what was? And so to end the evil of the Japanese Empire that not only attacked America, but brutalized Chinese people and other indigenous people. Without the tragedy of war, that evil would have done more evil. And when those bombs were dropped and that evil war stopped, Americans rejoiced. And so this psalmist is simply saying, people will rejoice when this evil empire of Babylon meets its end. That's what the psalmist is saying. And yes, we hate seeing innocent people suffer in war, and we should do everything we can to minimize it. But the truth is, evil hides among citizens, and you can't stop it as a nation without, unfortunately, some innocent people suffering. But remember who really caused it: the evil nation. Never, ever forget that. And that's the message for today. I'll see you tomorrow as we go in a different direction in Psalms, looking at this Psalm of David, thanksgiving for the Lord's favor, Psalm 138. God bless you, everybody.